Alright, this is chapter 6, the human body. Your national standard competencies for PrEP apply fundamental knowledge of the EMS system, safety, well-being of the emergency medical technician, and medical, legal, and ethical issues to the provision of emergency care. Your A&P is to apply fundamental knowledge of the anatomy and function of all human systems to the practice of EMS. And Patho is to apply fundamental knowledge of the pathophysiology of respiration and perfusion to patient assessment and management. Alright, you require a working knowledge of anatomy, and that is very important. Knowledge of anatomy helps to communicate correct information not only to other medical professionals, but also to others who may not understand medical terms. This is why we stress the importance of you memorizing those medical terminology phrases in the previous chapters. Topographic anatomy. Superficial landmarks serve as guides to structures that lie beneath them. Topographic anatomy applies to the body and the anatomic position so that everyone is referring to the body in the same way. This is going to be when the patient stands facing you, arms at the side and palms forward. Also remember that directional terms are from the patient's perspective. That means if you're referring to right and left, you're referring to the patient's right and left, not your right and left. Alright, planes of the body. These are imaginary straight lines that divide the body. There are three main areas depending on how the body is divided. You have the frontal or coronal plane. It divides the body from front and back. The transverse or axial plane divides the body top and bottom. And the sagittal or lateral plane divides the body left and right. There's also a special type of sagittal plane. This is the mid-sagittal plane, which means midline. Well, that's where the body is cut in half, leaving equal left and right portions. Okay, so here is a diagram of the planes. So here you have this purple one, the frontal coronal, and it passes through the body along this edge, and it divides the body into front and back. Then you have this kind of green yellow one, the transverse axial, divides the body here into top and bottom portions, and then the blue one here, the sagittal or lateral plane, divides the body down the middle. If it is directly midline, then that is a mid-sagittal, but otherwise it divides the body into left and right. Anatomy of the skeletal system. The skeleton gives us our recognizable human form and protects vital internal organs. There are different elements of the skeleton. You have bones, ligaments, tendons, and cartilage. You have 206 bones. This constitutes structure of the skeletal system and provides a framework for attachment of muscles. Ligaments, these are fibrous tissues that connect bones to each other, so that is bone to bone. Tendons are rope-like structures that connect muscles to bone. So remember, ligaments are bone to bone, tendon are muscle to bone. Cartilage is smooth connective tissues that covers the ends of the bones at mobile joints. The skeletal system is divided into two portions. You have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. And the axial skeleton is the foundation to which the arms and legs are attached. For the skull, you have the cranium and the face. The cranium protects the brain. It connects to the spinal cord through a large opening at the base of the skull, and this is called the foramen magnum. That is here. The cranium is made up of 4 bones. Posterior of the cranium, that's the back part, that is the occiput. The lateral portions of the cranium are called the temples or the temporal bones, and so those are here, right where your temples are. Between the temporal regions and the occiput are the parietal bones. So you're going to see that here. That's what forms basically the top and the sides of the head. And of course, the forehead here is the frontal bone. So your facial bones, you have 14 of those. And the upper non-movable jawbone, that is here, that is the maxilla. Cheekbones, here and here, are zygomas. And then the lower portion of the jaw, this is the movable part, that is the mandible. So your orbits, if you'll notice here, all the different colors are coming together. And that is actually made up of bones from the zygomas, the maxilla, the frontal bones of the cranium. All those fuse together to create your orbits or your eye sockets. And then you have very short bones here that form the bridge of the nose. Your spinal column, it is the central supporting structure of the body. It is composed of 33 bones, and these are called vertebrae. The vertebrae are named according to the section of the spine which they lie, and they are numbered from top to bottom. So in the neck, here, you have the cervical spine, and you have 7 of those. So those are numbered from top to bottom, C1 through C7. Then you have the thoracic spine. That's going to be your upper back here. You have 12 of those. Those are numbered T1 through T12, and 1 pair of ribs is attached to each of the 12 vertebrae. The lumbar spine, that's your lower back. You have 5 vertebrae. Those are L1 through L5. Your sacral vertebrae, that is the back wall of the pelvis. You have 5 vertebrae that are fused together to form the sacrum, and the sacrum joins the pelvis. So even though those are fused, they are still numbered S1 through S5. And then lastly, you have your coccyx, which is 4 vertebrae fused together, and that's referred to as the tailbone. Those are not numbered. So these vertebrae are connected by ligaments with intervertebral discs between each vertebrae. So in between each one of these bones, you have a disc that cushions them to keep those bones from moving together. Your thorax. The thoracic cavity contains the heart, lungs, esophagus, and great vessels, which are the aorta and the vena cava. It is formed by 12 thoracic vertebrae and 12 pairs of ribs. You see them numbered here, 1 through 12. In the midline of the chest, which means directly in the center, you have the sternum. The superior border of the sternum forms the easily palpable sternal notch. So superior, that's going to be up top. So right here, that's your sternal arch. The sternum contains 3 components. The manubrium, that's going to be the upper section here. And then you have the body, which is the bulk of the sternum here. And then the xiphoid process is a narrow cartilage tip here. The appendicular skeleton, you can remember this by knowing that your extremities are called appendages. So your extremities are the things that make up the appendicular skeleton. That is the arms, legs, their connection points, and the pelvis. We're going to talk about joints, upper extremities, the pelvis, and the lower extremities. Joints occur whenever bones come in contact. They consist of the ends of the bones and the surrounding connecting and supporting tissues. A symphysis is a joint with a slight limited motion in which the bone ends are held together by fibrous tissue. The bone ends of a joint are held together by fibrous sacs called a joint capsule. This may be lax and thin to allow motion, or thick, which resists stretching or bending. In moving joints, a thin layer of articular cartilage covers the ends of the bones. Synovial membranes are inner linings of the joint capsule, and they are responsible for making a thick lubricant called synovial fluid. So we're going to talk about two types of joints. You have a ball and socket joint, which allows rotation and bending. That's going to be like your shoulders and your hip. Then we have a hinge joint, just like a hinge on a door. The motion is restricted to flexion and extension, and these are going to be like your fingers, elbows, and the largest joint in the body, your knees. So this image shows a ball and socket. You notice here that you have the ball end of the bone, and it fits into a socket shaped kind of cup. That when these two fit together, it allows it to rotate inside there for movement. So the foot, this contains 7 tarsal bones. Those are going to be located in the ankle. Then you have the talus and the calcaneus. Those are the largest bones. So the talus is here. If you look on the outside of your ankle, that ball that you see on the outside, that is the talus. The calcaneus here is going to be your heel. The talus joins with the distal tibia and fibula to form the ankle joint. You have 5 metatarsal bones, and this is going to be the bones running along the length of your foot, just like in your hand. You have the plantar surface, which is the sole of your foot here, and then the dorsum is going to be the top of the foot here. And you have 5 toes that are formed by 14 phalanges. So that's going to be the joints. You have 2 phalanges in the great toe, which is the big toe, and 3 phalanges in each of the smaller toes. Alright, the physiology of the skeletal system. The skeletal system gives the body its shape. It protects fragile organs. It allows for movement, stores calcium, and helps to create blood cells. Similar to that, you have the musculoskeletal system. This is just adding muscles in with the bones. And this is the anatomy of that. So the musculoskeletal system provides form, upright posture, movement, and protects vital internal organs. So you have 3 types of muscles. They are skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Skeletal muscles attach to the bones of the skeleton and form the major muscle mass of the body. That's these here, and see the lines in those. Those are sometimes called striated because of those lines. These are voluntary muscles because they're under direct voluntary control of the brain. Your brain tells them to move, and they do that. Movement of the body results from skeletal muscle contraction or relaxation. Most of the muscles operate on the principle of antagonistic parts, meaning that it has something else that works against it. An example of that is where the biceps work to slow the movement of the triceps as the arm is extended. Smooth muscle here looks like this. It is found within blood vessels and intestines. And then cardiac muscle here, of course, is found only within the heart. And this diagram here shows you major muscle groups of the body. Physiology, contraction and relaxation of the system make it possible to move and manipulate the environment. A byproduct of this movement is heat. So when you get cold, you involuntarily shake your muscles. That makes you shiver and that produces heat. Another function of muscles is to protect the structures that are underneath them. Okay, so I would pause here, go back and review the skeletal and musculoskeletal systems. Make sure that you completely understand those before you move on to this section. So we have the respiratory system anatomy. The respiratory system consists of structures of the body that contribute to the process of breathing, also known as respiration. The upper airway, this is going to include the nose, mouth, tongue, jaw, larynx, pharynx, trachea, epiglottis, and esophagus. So you have your nose, you have your mouth, that's the oral cavity, the tongue, the jaw, specifically the mandible, and your larynx, that is the voice box. It is a complex arrangement of tiny bones, cartilage, and muscles, and that's where your vocal cords are. So the important thing to remember here is that the larynx is the dividing line between the upper and lower airway. That is a very testable question. All right, the larynx, it divides the upper and lower airway. All right, the pharynx is divided into three portions. You have the nasopharynx, behind the nose, oropharynx, oral, and the laryngopharynx. Now, at the base of the laryngopharynx, you have the trachea and the esophagus. And the esophagus is immediately posterior to the trachea. So what does that mean? It means it lies directly behind it. The trachea goes to the lungs, the esophagus goes to the stomach, and both of those have openings at the end of them. So when you eat, drink, swallow, what keeps that stuff from going into your trachea instead of your esophagus? That is this thing right here, your epiglottis. Okay? The epiglottis, and you need to remember this, is a thin leaf-shaped flap that prevents food and liquid from entering the trachea. Okay, that is very testable. You will see that again. Remember that it is leaf-shaped. So every time you swallow, regardless of what you're swallowing, this little flap closes over the trachea to keep what you're swallowing from going into your lungs, and it routes it down the esophagus to your stomach. The lower airway, you have the thyroid cartilage, which is the Adam's apple. It forms the anterior part of the larynx, anterior meaning the front part. Tiny muscles open and close the vocal cords and control tension, and sounds are created as air is forced past the vocal cords, making them vibrate. You have the cricoid cartilage, which is immediately below the thyroid cartilage, and in between those two cartilages, you have a cricothyroid membrane. The trachea lies below the cricoid cartilage. This is an important word here. Pen for important words. Okay, so your trachea ends at the carina. From the point of the carina, it divides into two tubes, the right and left mainstem bronchi, which enter the lungs and branch into smaller airways. So the level at which the trachea divides is the carina. Lungs, you have two of them, and they are held in place by the trachea, arteries and veins, and pulmonary ligaments. Each lung is divided into lobes. The right lung has an upper, middle, and lower lobe, so there's three of those. The left lung has an upper and lower lobe, so there's two of those, and that is because the heart also sits in the left side of the chest, so we have to have room for the heart and the lung. Within the lobes are the bronchi and bronchioles, which in small grape-like sacs, that's called the alveoli, and that is where the gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occur. The pleura is a layer of smooth, glistening tissue that covers each lung and lines the chest cavity. Between the two layers is a small amount of fluid that allows the tissues to glide smoothly. And here's a diagram of your lungs. So these are some of the things that we just talked about. You have the thyroid cartilage here, and it's blown up in this box here. You have the cricoid cartilage here at the bottom. In between those is the cricothyroid membrane that we talked about. So remember where the trachea divides, that is going to be below the cricoid cartilage. It goes into right and left mainstem bronchi, and that is the level of the carina. Okay, the part where it branches off and splits is the carina. And then where it branches off in these little trees, it goes into bronchioles, and you have the tiny little grape-like looking sacs at the very tip of all these, and that's your alveoli. There are muscles involved in breathing. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles are the primary muscles, but your main one is the diaphragm. It's the band that goes across the top of the abdomen, so it separates the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. Its automatic function is breathing. The intercostal muscles, those are going to be the muscles that lie in between each ribs. The space between one rib and another is called an intercostal space, so the intercostal muscles lie there. During inhalation, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract. They move the ribs up and out, enlarging the chest cavity. This decreases the pressure in the lungs and allows the air to move in. So when those muscles relax, the diaphragm flattens, the intercostal muscles relax, and the chest cavity goes down. It decreases the space of the chest cavity and increases the pressure on the lungs that allows air to move out and causes exhalation. Your neck muscles, your cervical muscles, those also help in breathing. Abdominal muscles and pectoral muscles, those are the muscles in your chest. Those all aid in the process of breathing. The physiology. The respiratory system's function is to provide the body with oxygen and eliminate carbon dioxide. Okay, that is the process of gas exchange. Ventilation and respiration are two separate yet interdependent functions of the respiratory system. All right, respiration. A lot of you are going to think this is breathing because you count breaths and you say that they have this many respirations. But respiration is actually the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveoli and in the tissues of the body. So it is that gas exchange that we've been talking about. That is an actual respiration. It provides much needed oxygen to the cells and removes the waste carbon dioxide. Oxygen passes from the blood through the capillaries to the tissue cells, and then carbon dioxide passes back. So it drops off oxygen and it picks the carbon dioxide up. Diffusion is the passive process in which oxygen molecules move from an area with a higher concentration of molecules to an area of lower concentration of molecules. So this doesn't have to have help. Nothing has to occur for this to happen. It's passive. It just does it on its own. When the oxygen passes by an area that has a lower amount of oxygen, then the oxygen cells just move to that area. The brainstem automatically controls breathing if the level of carbon dioxide, which is the waste, or the oxygen in arterial blood is too high or too low. So the medulla oblongata senses pH changes in the cerebrospinal fluid, and then it signals the diaphragm. The hypoxic drive, which hypoxic means what? Hypo's low. This is low oxygen. So the hypoxic drive is the backup system that controls the breathing. It is less sensitive and less powerful than the carbon dioxide sensors in the brainstem. The medulla keeps us breathing so that we don't have to think about it. It initiates the ventilation cycles. It is stimulated by high carbon dioxide levels, and it sets the base pattern for respirations. The pons has two areas that help augment respirations during emotional or physical stress. It is involved in changing the depth of inspiration, expiration, or both. Ventilation is the simple movement of air into and out of the lungs. This requires chest rise and fall. You provide ventilations when you assist a patient with a bag valve mask. The tidal volume is the amount of air that is moved into or out of the lungs during a single breath. So when you take a breath in, that amount of air that you breathe in, that is a tidal volume. Inspiratory reserve volume, this is the deepest breath that you can take after a normal breath. This is the exercise we did in class. If you take a deep breath in and then you suck just that last little bit of air in, that is inspiratory reserve. So your expiratory reserve, this is when we're breathing out. It's the maximum amount of air you can forcibly breathe out after a normal breath. So you take a breath in, breathe it out, and after you've got that breath out, give it one more push and push that last little puff of air out. That is the expiratory reserve volume. A residual volume is the gas that remains in the lungs to keep the lungs open. So you can remember that by residue being left behind. Something that's left behind is residual. Your dead space is the portion of the respiratory system that has no alveoli, so therefore there's little or no exchange of gas between air and blood occurring there. That space is just dead. A minute volume is the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs in 1 minute. So a respiratory rate times the tidal volume. So this is how many times they're breathing multiplied by how much air they're taking in tells you how much air they're getting in 1 minute. Respiratory rate times tidal volume equals minute volume. So if you have a person that's breathing 10 times a minute, their tidal volume is normal, which for an adult is around 500. So 10 times 500 would be 5,000 milliliters of air a minute would be their minute volume. Always evaluate the amount of air being moved with each breath when assessing a patient's respirations. Are they breathing normally? Are they breathing shallow? Are they breathing deeply? So characteristics of normal breathing. These patients are going to have a normal rate and depth and therefore a normal tidal volume, a regular rhythm or pattern of inhalation and exhalation, clear audible breath sounds on both sides of the chest. They'll have regular rise and fall on both sides of the chest, and they will have normal movement of the abdomen. Inadequate breathing patterns in adults. You'll have labored breathing. This requires effort and may involve accessory muscles. These muscles are the ones we talked about in the previous sections, musculoskeletal, so that's going to be the neck, the clavicle muscles, the intercostal muscles, the diaphragm. Their breathing could be much slower or it may be faster breathing than normal. Muscle retractions above the clavicles, between the ribs, below the rib cage, and this is especially in children. When you see those retractions, which means that the muscles are pulling back. So when they take a breath, you see spaces in their neck and the clavicles between the ribs, under the ribs, you see those pull in to where you can actually you can see their individual ribs. Those are signs that your patient is in respiratory distress. Those are called muscle retractions. If their skin is pale or cyanotic, remember cyanotic means blue. If their skin is cool or damp, that's known as clammy, and those are signs that your patient is in respiratory distress. A tripod position, your patient is sitting upright, leaning forward, and propping their palms of their hands on their knees to brace themselves and hold themselves up, and that's a tripod position. Agonal gasp, and this is very few respirations per minute. So they're going to breathe maybe 2 to 3 times a minute. They'll take a deep gasp and then nothing for like 20 seconds. Then they'll take another one. This usually indicates that they're going into cardiac arrest. And sometimes after the heart has stopped beating, they'll still have an occasional agonal gasp immediately after cardiac arrest. Alright, again, I encourage you to pause here, go over the respiratory system and everything we just talked about. Make sure that you have a full understanding of that before you start this section. And this is the circulatory system of the anatomy. The circulatory system, also known as the cardiovascular system, is a complex arrangement of connected tubes. You have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And this is broken up into 2 circuits, the systemic circulation for the body and the pulmonary circulation for the lungs. The heart is a hollow muscular organ that is approximately the size of an adult's clenched fist. It is made of specialized cardiac muscle called a myocardium and works as 2 paired pumps. The septum divides the right and left sides of the heart. Each side is divided into top and bottom portions. So the atrium is the upper chambers and the ventricles are the lower chambers. In the circulation, the heart receives its blood from the aorta. The right side receives deoxygenated blood from the veins, and the left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. Here's a diagram of those. The right side of the heart receives blood from the veins of the body. The blood enters from the superior and inferior vena cava, it's happening here, into the right atrium and then fills the right ventricle. As the right ventricle contracts, blood flows into the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary circulation system here, okay? And then it goes out to the lungs. Oxygenated blood returns from the lungs through the pulmonary veins here. It goes into the left atrium, passes into the left ventricle, and then it is pumped into the aorta and then to the arteries of the body. So it goes out here. One-way valve governs the exit of blood from each of the 4 chambers. One-way valves prevent backflow of blood. When a valve controlling the entry to a heart chamber is open, the valve that controls the exit is shut, and vice versa. So only one of these valves is open at a time. Alright, a normal resting heart rate for an adult is 60 to 100 beats per minute. The stroke volume is the amount of blood moved by 1 beat. 1 beat. The cardiac output is the amount of blood moved in 1 minute. So in order to determine that, you take the heart rate times the stroke volume, and that gives you the actual cardiac output amount. The electrical conduction system. This is a network of specialized tissue that is capable of conducting electrical current runs throughout the heart. And the flow of electrical current causes smooth and coordinated heart contractions. The contractions then produce the pumping action of the heart. Each mechanical contraction is associated with 2 electrical processes, depolarization and repolarization. Depolarization is when the electrical charge on the surface of the muscle cell changes from positive to negative. Repolarization is when the heart returns to its resting state and the positive charge is restored to the surface. Electrical impulses begin high in the atria at the sinoatrial node or the SA node and travel to the atrioventricular or AV node and down the bundle of his and then move through the Purkinje fibers to the ventricle. So you have this whole little electrical network, basically starts at the top of the heart, moves its way down the middle and to the bottom. This movement produces a smooth flow of electricity, leading to a coordinated pumping action. When the conduction system is injured, the heart will not beat properly. The arteries carry blood from the heart to all body tissues. They contract to accommodate loss of blood and increase blood pressure so as to supply tissues as needed. The aorta is the main artery leading the left side of the heart and carrying freshly oxygenated blood to the body. It has many branches that supply the vital organs. The coronary arteries go to the heart. Carotid arteries supply the head. Hepatic arteries supply the liver. Renal arteries supply the kidneys. And the mesenteric arteries supply the digestive system. These divide at the level of the umbilicus, which is your belly button, to split into two iliac arteries. The pulmonary artery originates at the right ventricle and it carries oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. Arteries branch into smaller arteries and then into arterioles. Arterioles branch into a series of increasingly smaller vessels until they connect to a vast network of capillaries. Your pulse is palpated most easily at the neck, wrist, or groin. It is created by the forceful pumping of blood out of the left ventricle and into the major arteries. And this is a diagram of all of your major arteries and major veins. Notice that they run alongside each other. The blue is the vein because it is deoxygenated, and the red is the artery because it is oxygenated. Capillaries are tiny blood vessels that connect arterioles to venules. They allow contact between blood and the cells of the tissues. Oxygen and nutrients pass from blood cells and plasma in the capillaries to individual tissue cells through a very thin wall of capillaries. There are billions of capillaries in the body. Your veins return oxygen-depleted blood to the heart. Blood moves from venules to the heart via a network of larger and larger veins. Your major veins are the superior vena cava, which carries blood returning from the head, neck, shoulders, and upper extremities, and the inferior vena cava carries blood from the abdomen, pelvis, and lower extremities. These two join at the right atrium. The spleen is a solid organ located under the rib cage in the left upper part of the abdomen. It filters worn-out blood cells, foreign substances, and bacteria from the blood. It is highly vascular and is particularly susceptible to injury from blunt trauma, which means it can lead to severe internal bleeding. Your blood composition, you have plasma, red blood cells, which are erythrocytes. Remember that erythro means red. White blood cells are leukocytes, leuko meaning white, and platelets. So the plasma is the liquid portion of the blood. It contains water and proteins as the primary components, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, nutrients, and cellular waste. The red blood cells, or erythrocytes, contain hemoglobin, which gives blood its color. I would remember that. They carry oxygen. White blood cells are leukocytes. They play a role in the body's immune defense to fight infection, and your platelets are essential in the initial formation of a blood clot. All right, the physiology of the circulatory system. Blood pressure is pressure that the blood exerts against the walls of arteries. You have systole, which is when the left ventricle of the heart contracts and it pumps blood from the ventricle into the aorta. Diastole is when the muscle of the ventricle relaxes and the ventricle fills with blood. Okay, so systole is when it pumps, it contracts. Diastole is at rest. Your blood pressure reading comes from the forceful ejection of blood from the left ventricle into the aorta. It is transmitted through the arteries as a pulsatile pressure wave. This can be measured with a blood pressure cuff. That is called a sphygmomanometer. That is my favorite word. And matter of fact, if you're listening to this, text me my favorite word for a bonus point. Okay, so systolic blood pressure. It is a high point of wave as the heart is contracting. The diastolic blood pressure is the low point of the wave as the heart is in the relaxation phase. So systolic is your top number, diastolic is your bottom number. This is expressed in millimeters of mercury, also noted as mmHg. The H is capital. Normal circulation in adults. So this is automatically adjusted and controlled. Perfusion is the circulation of blood in an organ or tissue in adequate amounts to meet the current needs of the cell. Okay, let's say that and read that again. Perfusion is the circulation of blood in an organ or tissue in adequate amounts to meet the needs of cells. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute. So, blood enters organs and tissues through arteries and leaves through veins. This is that process here. So, again, the artery, it's red, it is full of oxygen, and it enters into the organs and tissues through the arteries, and then it goes through all these little capillaries, and it does the gas exchange, and then it comes back out of the vein. It leaves the organs and tissues through the vein. So notice how this gets large to small and back large again. So the artery becomes arterioles, becomes capillaries, becomes venules, becomes a vein. Okay? That's the process of that. So the system can adjust to compensate for small blood loss. Vessels will constrict and the heart will pump more rapidly. But with a large blood loss, adjustment fails and the patient goes into shock. What is shock? Shock is hypoperfusion. So remember I told you, remember what perfusion was. The circulation of blood in an organ or tissue in adequate amounts to meet the current needs of the cells. So hypoperfusion means that that is decreased and those functions are not occurring. Okay? So with a large loss, adjustment fails and the patient goes into shock or hypoperfusion. This can be expressed by the following formula. So you have a mean arterial pressure or MAP, MAP, and that is going to be determined by heart rate times stroke volume, and then that number multiplied by systemic vascular resistance. So MAP equals HR times SV, and then that number times the SVR. That formula should be in your book. All right, functions of blood. You have perfusion, transporting oxygen and transporting carbon dioxide, transporting waste and nutrients, and clotting or coagulation. The nervous system control of the cardiovascular system. You have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response. It sends commands to the adrenal glands, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline or noradrenaline, are hormones that are secreted to stimulate the heart and blood vessels. Blood vessels have alpha adrenergic receptors. When stimulated, the blood vessels constrict, increasing the blood pressure. The heart and lungs have beta adrenergic receptors. When stimulated, the heart rate increases. Bronchi and the lungs dilate, allowing more air to be inhaled and exhaled. The parasympathetic nervous system addresses actions that do not require an immediate response. When stimulated, this system causes the heart to slow and beat more quickly. The opposition between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems allows the body to respond appropriately. So the sympathetic is the fight or flight. The heart rate increases, the blood pressure increases. And the parasympathetic is the feed and breathe. Things slow down. Alright, this is the time to pause and make sure you go back over the cardiovascular system. Make sure you understand all of that that's going on there before you start on the next portion. This is the nervous system. Alright, A&P, the nervous system is perhaps the most complex organ system in the body. It is divided into two main portions. That is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, or the CNS, contains the brain and spinal cord. The brain is the controlling organ of the body. It has major subdivisions of the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. Let me get my laser here. Okay, so this area. This is the cerebrum. It is the largest part of the brain. It has 4 lobes. If you remember the bones that we talked about in the cranium, those have the same name. So you have the frontal, which will be here. The parietal will be these areas. The temporal will be over the temple region, and the occipital is back here at the occiput. So these control the activities on the opposite side of the body. So if you have an injury on the left side of the brain, it affects the right side of the body. The right side of the brain affects the left side of the body. The cerebellum, which is this area here, it coordinates body movements. And then the brainstem, which is here. So it controls body functions necessary for life, including cardiac and respiratory functions and regulation of consciousness. And the brainstem is divided into 3 regions. They are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain stem. It is made up of nerve fibers that extend from the cells of the brain and join together below the brain stem to form the spinal cord. This transmits messages between the brain and the body, encased within the spinal canal for protection, and it contains cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which cushions the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system are nerves outside the brain and spinal cord that link the central nervous system to various organs of the body. It consists of long fibers that extend from the cell body out through openings in the bony coverings to form a cable of nerve fibers that link the central nervous system to the various organs of the body. This is divided into 2 main portions, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is voluntary. It transmits signals from the brain to voluntary muscles and allows for activities such as walking, talking, and writing. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary. It controls involuntary actions necessary for basic body functions. These are things like digestion, dilation, constriction of blood vessels, and sweating. The autonomic nervous system is also split into 2 areas. And these are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems that we just talked about. So again, sympathetic is responsible for fight or flight, and the parasympathetic slows the body down. There are two types of nerves within the peripheral nervous system. You have sensory and motor nerves. Sensory nerves carry information from the body to the central nervous system. They are constantly providing information to the brain about what different parts of the body are doing in relation to their surroundings. Motor nerves carry information from the brain to muscles. Each muscle in the body has its own motor nerve. Electrical impulses produced by cell bodies in the spinal cord are transmitted along the motor nerves to muscles, causing it to contract. All right, pause here. Make sure you go over the nervous system and understand that before you continue with this section. This is the integumentary system, also known as your skin. You have two layers of skin. They are the epidermis, which is the superficial, and the dermis, which is the deeper. And then you also have a subcutaneous tissue layer that lies beneath the skin. That is fat that insulates and serves as an energy reservoir. And there is a diagram of everything that's contained in these layers. So here is the epidermis. It is the superficial or outer layer of skin. It is sealed to form a watertight protective covering. It varies in thickness in different areas of the body. It is composed of several layers of cells. You have a germinal layer, which is here, and that produces new cells. Your stratum corneal layer lies below that, and it is the surface layer of dead cells. And then you also need to know that skin cells are constantly being replaced, so this is a never-ending cycle. Your dermis, which is the deeper layer here, it contains special structures of the skin. Sweat glands here produce sweat for cooling the body. Sebaceous glands here. They secrete sebum, which provides waterproofing and softening. Hair follicles are small organs that produce hair. So that is the hair, and then down here is the hair follicle. And what else do we have? Blood vessels provide nutrients and oxygen to the skin. Mucous membranes cover bodily orifices such as the mouth, nose, and vagina, and they provide a protective barrier like skin. Secrete mucus, a watery substance that lubricates the openings. And mucous membranes are moist, whereas the skin is dry. Okay, and then here's that subcutaneous tissue layer that we were talking about with the fat deposits here. So you need to know that the subcu or subcutaneous tissue is the layer of fat that serves as an insulator and also as an energy reservoir. Physiology of the integumentary system. The skin is the largest single organ in the body. It serves three major functions. They are to protect the body in the environment and protects the body from infectious organisms. Regulates body temperature. Sweat is secreted to the skin surface from the sweat glands and transmits information from the environment to the brain. This is when the skin reacts to pressure, pain, and pleasurable stimuli. All right, that's it for the integumentary system. There's not too much with that. The digestive system, the anatomy. Digestion is the process of food that nourishes the individual cells of the body. The digestive system is also called the gastrointestinal or GI system. Components of the digestive system. include the abdomen, which is the second major body cavity. It contains major organs of digestion and excretion, and quadrants are the easiest way to identify the area. It's divided into 4 quadrants. So you have the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower, and left lower quadrants. Those are the RUQ, LUQ, RLQ, and LLQ abbreviations that you've seen before. So here, you see the division of the quadrants along these lines. So, right upper quadrant, and remember this is the patient's right, not your right. So we're over here. That contains the liver, gallbladder, and portion of the colon. The left upper quadrant contains the stomach, spleen, and portion of the colon. The right lower quadrant contains 2 portions of the large intestine, which are the cecum and the ascending colon. So ascending means it's going up. So this is the ascending colon here. All right. The appendix is attached to the lower cecum, which is that little dangly thing right there. Then the left lower quadrant over here, you have the descending colon. That's the part of the colon that's coming down here. Okay. You have the sigmoid portion of the colon. Always remember, again, the quadrants refer to the patient's right and left. The small intestines, pancreas, large intestines, and urinary bladder lie in more than one quadrant. And the kidneys and pancreas lie behind the abdominal cavity. The mouth consists of the lips, cheeks, gums, teeth, and tongue, and also salivary glands. You have 2 sets of those on each side of the mouth and in front of each ear. Saliva serves as a binder for chewed food and as a lubricant. The oropharynx is a tubular structure that extends from the back of the mouth to the esophagus and trachea. The esophagus is a collapsible tube about 10 inches long that extends from the end of the pharynx to the stomach, and muscles in the wall of the esophagus propel food to the stomach. The stomach is a hollow organ in the left upper quadrant of the abdomen. It receives food, stores it, and provides for its movement into the bowel. The pancreas is a flat, solid organ that lies below and behind the liver and stomach. It has 2 portions. They are exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine portion secretes pancreatic juice containing enzymes that aid in digestion of fat, starch, and protein. And the endocrine portion, the islets of Langerhans, produce insulin and glucagon. The liver is the large solid organ immediately beneath the diaphragm in the right upper quadrant that extends into the left upper quadrant. It is the largest solid organ in the abdomen and made up of a large mass of blood vessels and cells. The liver has many functions, filtering harmful substances, forming the factors needed for blood clotting and normal plasma production, and the principal organ for storing sugar or starch for immediate use by the body for energy. Bile ducts, and the major function of bile is the digestion of fat. Bile ducts connect the liver to the intestine. The gallbladder is a small pouch extending from the bile ducts that serves as a reservoir and concentrating organ for bile produced in the liver. The small intestine is the major hollow organ of the abdomen. It produces enzymes and mucus to aid in digestion. It is composed of the duodenum, which receives food from the stomach, the jejunum, and the ileum. More than 90% of the products of digestion are absorbed across the wall of the small intestines into the veins. The large intestine is the major hollow organ consisting of the cecum, colon, and rectum, and its major function is to absorb the final 10%, 5 to 10% of digested food and water from the intestines to form solid stool. The appendix is a 3 to 4 inch long tube that opens into the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine, in the right lower quadrant of the abdomen. It may easily become obstructed, inflamed, or infected, which is known as appendicitis. Appendicitis is one of the major causes of severe abdominal distress. The rectum is the lowermost end of the colon. It is a large hollow organ adapted to hold quantities of feces until it is expelled. At the terminal end is the anus. Both the rectum and anus have sphincters. These are complex circular muscles that control the escape of liquids, gases, and solids from the digestive tract. Digestion is a complicated chemical process. Enzymes are added to food by the salivary glands, stomach, liver, pancreas, and small intestines. Food is converted into basic sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. These basic products of digestion are carried across the wall of the intestines to the liver and processed further and stored or transported to the heart. They are then circulated via the blood throughout the body. Alright, that's all for the digestive system. Make sure you understand that before you move forward. This is the lymphatic system. Elements of the lymphatic system are the spleen, lymph nodes, lymph vessels, thymus gland, and other components. It supports the circulatory system and the immune system. Lymph is a thin, straw-colored fluid that carries oxygen, nutrients, and hormones to the cells and waste products of metabolism away from the cells to be excreted. Make sure you know that lymph is thin, straw-colored fluid. So lymph vessels form a network throughout the body that serves as an auxiliary to the circulatory system. It relies on muscle contractions and movements of the body for lymph to flow. Lymph nodes are tiny oval-shaped structures that filter the lymph. This helps to rid the body of toxins and other harmful materials. The endocrine system. The endocrine system is a complex message and control system. It integrates many body functions. The endocrine glands release hormones directly into the bloodstream. Examples are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and insulin. Each endocrine gland produces one or more hormones, and each of those hormones has a specific effect on some organ, tissue, or process. The adrenal regulates the stress response, which is the fight or flight response. Ovaries regulate sexual function, characteristics, and reproduction in women. The pancreas regulates glucose metabolism and other functions. Parathyroid regulates serum calcium. Pituitary regulates all other endocrine glands. The testes regulate sexual function, characteristics, and reproduction in men. And thyroid regulates metabolism. So the brain controls the release of the hormones. Hormones can have a stimulating or inhibiting effect on the body's organs and systems. The tightly controlled communication system uses primary and secondary feedback loops to keep the body in balance. Excesses or deficiencies in hormones can cause disease processes such as diabetes. Alright, anatomy and physiology of the urinary system. The urinary system controls the discharge of certain waste materials filtered from the blood by the kidneys. Kidneys are solid organs. The ureters, bladder, and urethra are hollow organs. Make sure you know the difference between those. Main functions of the urinary system are to control fluid balance in the body, filter and eliminate waste, and control pH balance. The body has two kidneys that lie in the retroperitoneal space, and that is the space behind the abdomen. The kidneys rid the blood of toxic waste products and control the balance of water and salt. Waste products in water are constantly filtered from the blood to form urine. The kidneys concentrate this filtered urine by reabsorbing the water as it passes through a system of specialized tubes. A ureter passes from each kidney to drain into the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is located immediately behind the pubic symphysis in the pelvic cavity. The bladder empties to the outside of the body through the urethra. Okay, anatomy and physiology of the genital system. The genital system controls the reproductive processes by which life is created. The male reproductive system consists of the testicles, epididymis, vastus deferentia, prostate gland, seminal vesicles, and the penis. These lie outside the pelvic cavity except for the prostate gland and seminal vesicles. It produces sperm and sex hormones, and the penis is also part of the urinary system because it contains the urethra. The female reproductive system consists of the ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, cervix, and vagina. It is contained entirely within the pelvic cavity except for the clitoris and the labia. It produces egg cells or ovum and sex hormones. All right, the life support chain. Cells are the foundation of the human body. All cells in the body require oxygen, nutrients, and removal of waste. The respiratory and circulatory systems are the carrier of these supplies and waste. If interference occurs, cells become damaged and die. Cells use oxygen to take available nutrients and turn them into chemical energy through metabolism. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is used to store energy. Aerobic metabolism uses oxygen. The brain and heart require constant supplies of oxygen. Most cells switch to anaerobic metabolism, meaning that it does not use oxygen when oxygen is limited. Lactic acid is a damaging waste product that is produced by this process. Movement of oxygen, waste, and nutrients occurs by diffusion. The pH is critical to diffusion. It is the measure of acidity or alkalinity, and the body expends a large amount of energy to maintain normal pH. Pathophysiology is the study of functional changes that occur when the body reacts to disease. Many diseases can occur in patients. Diabetes is a disease of the pancreas. Stroke is a disease of the brain. Pneumonia is a disease of the lungs. Respiratory compromise is the inability of the body to move gas effectively. This can lead to hypoxia, which is a decreased level of oxygen in the body, or hypercarbia, which is an elevated level of carbon dioxide in the body. Factors that can impair ventilation are a blocked airway, impairment of the muscles of breathing, if the airway is obstructed physiologically, such as in an asthma attack, or numerous other factors, such as drug overdose, trauma to the chest wall, or an allergic reaction. Factors that impair respiration are changes in the atmosphere, high altitudes, or impaired movement of gas across the cell membrane. This is ventilation and perfusion mismatch. So the VQ ratio describes how much gas is being moved effectively through the lungs and how much blood is flowing around the alveoli where gas exchange or perfusion occurs. A mismatch occurs when one of those two variables is abnormal, and respiratory compromise can occur. So this could be that the patient's not getting enough oxygen for the blood to carry to the tissues, or if a patient's anemic, they may not have enough blood cells to carry the oxygen. The effects of respiratory compromise on the body: oxygen levels throughout the body fall and carbon dioxide levels rise. The brain detects an increase in carbon dioxide levels. The body then increases its respiratory rate in an attempt to return the carbon dioxide levels to normal. If increased respiratory does not occur or is not effective in returning the carbon dioxide levels to normal, then the blood will become more acidic. Similarly, blood oxygen levels will begin to fall, and this will cause the brain to issue further commands to breathe. Shock is the condition in which organs and tissue receive an inadequate flow of blood and oxygen, known as perfusion. So again, that's why we said hypoperfusion. This can occur due to inadequacy of the central or peripheral circulation. Impaired oxygen delivery causes cellular hypoxia, and that leads to anaerobic metabolism, lactic acid production, and organ dysfunction. Shock is categorized into several types depending on the cause. Effects of shock on the body. Similar to the effects of respiratory compromise, the level of oxygen supplied to the tissue falls. Cells engage in anaerobic metabolism and result in lactic acid production. Severe metabolic acidosis ensues, leading to increased levels of carbon dioxide within the blood. Baroreceptors detect decreased blood pressure and initiate the release of epinephrine or norepinephrine. The heart rate increases and beats more forcefully, and blood vessels constrict. Interstitial fluid moves into the capillaries, and once a certain level of tissue hypoperfusion is reached, cell damage proceeds in a similar manner regardless of the underlying cause of the shock. Impairment of cellular metabolism results in the inability to properly use oxygen and glucose at the cellular level. When there is inadequate oxygen, cells will create energy through anaerobic metabolism. This serves as a temporary backup system and can result in metabolic acidosis. It requires more energy than when using glucose for fuel, more waste to remove from the body, and the body must work harder. The decreased ability of the blood to effectively carry oxygen to the cells occurs, and overall decreased functioning of oxygen within the cell. Brain cells cannot use alternative fuels. They rely on a constant supply of glucose to function. If the supply of available glucose is dramatically decreased, brain cells will quickly become damaged or die. Cellular injury up to a point may be repairable if normal tissue perfusion is restored, and when irreversible injury occurs, no treatment will help. Alright, that is the end of Chapter 6. If you have any questions, make sure that you reach out to the instructors, and your test will be Monday.